Imagine a continent that seems to be healing. Cafes crowded, factories humming, treaties signed. Now imagine that lifeline, tiny and invisible, suddenly snipped. Credit vanishes, exports freeze, wages evaporate. That cut in October 1929 didn't just collapse the stock market in New York. It started a chain reaction that shattered livelihoods worldwide, discredited liberal governments, and handed political advantage to those who promised simple solutions and harsh remedies. Those years between 1929 and 1933 were the short fuse on a continent already full of kindling. What followed was not inevitable, but it was made far more likely by the choices leaders took then, and the desperation of millions who felt they had nothing left to lose. The crash and the global shock, October 1929, 1930. On October 24, 1929, Black Thursday, panic selling began on the New York Stock Exchange. Within days, markets plunged further. On October 29th, Black Tuesday, the crash reached new lows. The Wall Street collapse was the dramatic moment everyone remembers, but its deeper danger was financial interconnection. During the 1920s, American banks had extended large short-term loans to Europe, capital that helped Germany stabilize under the Dawes Plan and fueled recovery and credit across the continent. When confidence evaporated in New York, American lenders began recalling loans. International credit lines dried up. Trade collapsed. World exports dropped by roughly half between 1929 and 1932. Factories that relied on foreign orders closed, shipping slowed, and prices for raw materials fell. Governments that had borrowed to rebuild now faced the impossible task of repaying debts in hard currency while tax revenues plunged. Unemployment soared. In the United States, it rose from roughly 3% in 1929 to around 25% by 1933. In Germany, unemployment rose even faster as American funds vanished. Industries shut, breadlines formed, and desperation spread from cities to small towns. This was more than an economic contraction. It was a political earthquake that undermined faith in parliamentary politics and in the institutions that had promised stability after 1918. Why Germany suffered so badly? Germany's economy was peculiarly exposed. The Dawes Plan of 1924 had stabilized reparations through American loans, creating a cycle in which Germany borrowed from U.S. banks to pay reparations to France and Britain, who then repaid their loans to the American lenders. That fragile pyramid depended on continuous credit flows. When those flows ended, the house of cards collapsed. Industry contracted sharply. Investment vanished. Banks faced runs. In rural Germany, farmers lost markets. In urban centers, millions lost work. The Weimar Republic, still politically fragile after the trauma of Versailles, hyperinflation, and the failed uprisings of the early 1920s, now had to govern a society sliding into mass hardship. Coalition governments found it increasingly difficult to act decisively. Paralysis at the center bred anger on the extremes. The economic shock intensified social polarization. For industrial workers, despair made radical promises attractive. For the middle classes whose savings had been eroded and whose status felt threatened, the promise of restored national pride and order resonated. Political violence escalated. Street clashes between communists and right-wing paramilitaries, rallies that turned into fights, and radical organizations that offered protection, meaning, and scapegoats. Political collapse, emergency rule, and the loss of faith across Europe. Democratic institutions were tested by austerity and mass unemployment. Governments that cut spending to balance budgets were seen as callous. Those that printed money risked inflation or foreign condemnation. The options seemed poison. In Germany, the fragile parliamentary system sputtered through a succession of short-lived coalition governments. By 1930, President Paul von Hindenburg increasingly turned to emergency presidential decrees under Article 48 of the Weimar Constitution to keep the state running. Democratic norms eroded. chancellors were appointed and dismissed without meaningful parliamentary consensus. Voters punished the parties associated with compromise and parliamentary gridlock. They gravitated instead toward parties that promised decisive solutions. Electoral volatility grew. The Communist Party attracted disaffected workers. On the right, nationalist parties and paramilitary groups gained recruits. Among these, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazis, moved from a fringe movement to a national force. Their blend of nationalism, anti-parliamentarian rhetoric, anti-Semitic scapegoating, and promises of employment found wide resonance in a society where millions felt abandoned. Political strategy and the Nazi breakthrough, 1929 to 1932. The Nazis did not win power by winning a majority at a single stroke. They crept into influence through elections, propaganda, and violence. Their SA, Sturmabteilung, provided a visible sign of discipline and order on the streets, intimidating opponents and projecting strength. Meanwhile, the party's propaganda machine, radio broadcasts, rallies, posters, translated crisis into a political narrative. The Republic was weak, Versailles had humiliated Germany, the old elites had failed, and the nation needed a leader who could restore dignity and prosperity. Electoral gains were dramatic. In the September 1930 Reichstag elections, the Nazis won 18.3% of the vote and became the second largest party. By July 1932, they were the largest single party with 37% of the vote. But they still lacked an absolute majority and could not unilaterally form a stable government in the Weimar parliamentary system. This was where conservative elites and traditional power brokers made a crucial error. Many among the aristocracy, business leaders, and conservative politicians believed they could control Hitler, use his mass movement to break strikes, suppress leftists, and restore order, then contain him once those aims were achieved. They persuaded President Hindenburg and key figures like Franz von Papen that bringing Hitler into government under conservative tutelage was the least bad option to stabilize the country. On January 30th, 1933, this plan culminated in Hindenburg's appointment of Adolf Hitler as Chancellor. A democratic process, appointed by the president, had produced an authoritarian chancellor. Conservative backroom politics had, in effect, handed the keys of the state to a movement whose ideology and methods were anti-democratic. The role of violence, propaganda, and institutions. It is vital to understand how economic desperation translated into political advantage. The Nazis exploited breadlines and unemployment to frame Jews, communists, and the old political class as culprits, promising work projects, national renewal, and revenge for humiliation. Their paramilitary units, combined with legal and semi-legal pressure, made public space unsafe for opponents, while propaganda used radio and press to create a sense of inevitability around their rule. At the same time, Germany's institutions, courts, civil service, police, were not yet uniformly loyal to democratic norms. Many conservative officials believed they could work within a Hitler cabinet to preserve order and property. That miscalculation underestimated the Nazis' capacity for rapid institutional capture, controlling the police, filling administrative posts with loyalists, and swiftly reshaping the legal framework. The Reichstag fire on February 27, 1933, and the subsequent Reichstag fire decree provided a pretext for emergency measures that suspended civil liberties and suppressed organized opposition. We will examine such events in more detail in the dedicated Hitler episode, but here it is important to register how quickly legal erosion followed political appointment. International context, where else extremism rose. Germany's slide into crisis was part of a larger pattern. Italy had already given Europe an example. Mussolini's rise in 1922 showed that conservative elites might prefer a strongman to chaotic parliamentary politics. In Japan, economic strain and nationalist militarism drove expansion into Manchuria in 1931. Communist movements remained a potent force in many countries. Showed its weakness when it could not impose meaningful sanctions or enforce collective security. Democracies from Britain to France watched these developments with a mixture of alarm and distraction, often more focused on domestic politics and balancing budgets than confronting ideological threats abroad. These international developments mattered because they created an atmosphere of permissiveness. When established powers did not decisively punish aggression, economic, military, or political, others interpreted restraint as weakness. The lesson taken by many authoritarian-minded actors was simple. If the international community will not enforce limits, power can be grasped and held by those willing to use it. Economic policies, social measures, and popular responses. Once in power, those who wished to hold on to democratic checks and balances found themselves negotiating with extremists who promised rapid relief. The Nazis, like many authoritarian movements, combined charismatic leadership with concrete promises: massive public works to reduce unemployment, rearmament programs to revive industry, and social measures that appeared to reward true Germans. But it is critical to see these policies in context. Even before 1933, many mainstream parties had supported protectionist measures, tariffs, and state intervention to preserve jobs. Authoritarian movements succeeded not simply because of grand ideological seduction, but because the existing political center had already accepted extraordinary economic measures and emergency powers in crises, making the transition to autocracy more feasible. When the economic shock deepened, this normalization of emergency governance made the final step into dictatorship less abrupt than it might have been in calmer times. The conservative miscalculation and the speed of capture. The key political mistake of the era was a repeated belief among established elites that authoritarian movements could be contained. They underestimated both the popular appeal and the ruthlessness of these movements. In Germany, conservatives thought they could control Hitler. In practice, once in government, the Nazis moved quickly. They secured emergency powers, banned opposition parties, and neutralized independent institutions. The civil service, judiciary, and police, many staffed by conservative professionals, found themselves compromised, co-opted, or outmaneuvered. This is not to say that structural economic misery automatically produced dictatorship. France and Britain had mass unemployment too, yet they maintained parliamentary systems. But the combination of social fragmentation, a crippled economy heavily dependent on foreign credit, weak institutions left over from wartime compromises, and elite misjudgment formed a high-risk mix that the Nazis exploited with brutal efficiency. From crisis to catastrophe. Between 1929 and 1933, the world experienced an economic collapse that was also a political collapse in many places. Credit vanished, trade dried up, and millions lost livelihoods. Democracies stumbled under the weight of mass unemployment and lost legitimacy. Extremist movements translated material desperation into political momentum. Conservative elites who feared revolution made fatal bargains, believing they could harness authoritarian forces to protect order, and instead ignited totalitarianism. By the end of 1933, the European order had shifted dramatically from a fragile, contested peace to a structure in which authoritarian powers were consolidating control. Rearmament was quietly beginning, and ideological conflicts that had simmered since 1919 were now erupting into political reality. The Second World War did not arrive overnight, but in these years the necessary conditions congealed: mass misery, delegitimized institutions, emboldened extremists, and international inaction. When we return, we will examine how Hitler and the Nazi state moved from consolidation to expansion, how the mechanisms of power, propaganda, and policy turned domestic crisis into international aggression. For now, the lesson of 1929 to 1933 is plain. Economic collapse can be political dynamite, and when leaders choose short-term order over long-term democratic resilience, the consequences can be catastrophic.